Welcome to the Web Platform Podcast, a developer discussion that dives deep into all things web. We discuss topics relevant to developing for the modern web and the web platform of today, tomorrow, and beyond.
Welcome to the Web Platform Podcast, episode number 136. We're going to be talking all about the Polymer Summit that just recently happened. We're doing a bit better on our recap show than how long it took us to get our Google I/O recap show out. So props to us. We're very happy about that. I'm your host this week, Danny Blue, and with me as always is Amal Hussein and Leon Revill.
Hello, everybody.
Leon, there's been some things happening in the web this week. Why don't you take us through this week's This Week in Web?
Thank you very much, Danny. There has indeed. So since last week, 4 more frameworks have been added to Custom Elements Everywhere, which is a website which scores JavaScript frameworks on their compatibility with custom elements. The frameworks which have been added include AngularJS 1.x, CanJS, and Dojo 2. Apple has published guidelines for building augmented reality interfaces to aid developers using ARKit. And on a similar note, Google has just released a preview for AR Core and Web AR Core for AR development on Android and on the web. Node.js has been forked yet again over complaints of unresponsive leadership, and the new product is called AO, which I think I'm pronouncing correctly, and is already available on GitHub. Stencil.js, the magical reusable web component generator, which was announced at the Polymer Summit, appears to be making waves in the web component community, and we've just scheduled a podcast episode with the developers, which should be released in the next couple of weeks. And YouTube has just had a new UI released, which is written in Polymer, which is obviously quite relevant to this episode. And that's all I've got for This Week in Web. Thanks, Danny.
Thank you very much, Leon. And with us this week, we always have special guests, but we have a couple more special guests. We have Lars Knudsen and Kenneth Christiansen. Starting with Lars, why don't you guys go around, tell us a little bit about yourselves.
Yeah, hi, I'm Lars. I've been working in web for, I think, 15 years now. I was part of the web team in Nokia together with Kenneth, doing web browser for the Linux devices, and currently I am freelancing and working on evangelizing on the hardware to web connectivity that recently became available from Google, and I think that's pretty exciting. So that's me.
Hi, I'm Kenneth Christiansen. I work at Intel. I'm a web platform architect. So it's basically my job to try to move the web forward and figure out how Intel can align their strategy together with what's going on the web and basically enable web apps for everyone.
That sounds fantastic. So, like I said at the beginning, we're talking all about Polymer Summit, which just recently ended. I have not had a big chance to pay a lot of attention to what went on at Polymer Summit. So why don't you all give me your overall impressions of the summit? How did it compare to previous years? That kind of thing.
Sure, I can do that. I think this is actually my first Polymer Summit. I have watched the videos from the previous years, but what I'm hearing from people is that it was really good this year and on par with Amsterdam. So it was a really nice venue, a lot of people. What I really liked this year is that it was not just Googlers on stage. So they had big companies like Electronic Arts. They had the Ionic framework announcing Stencil. And they even have a lot of people from the community who have tried working on, for instance, enabling server-side rendering using web components and Shadow DOM. So a lot of nice things going on, and it was pretty cool meeting all these people that I'm following on Twitter. And I think it was a super exciting event.
Yeah, I was pretty happy to see that it was actually possible for the company I've been working for, a CPI resuscitation company, old legacy stuff that has migrated to Polymer. They were allowed to put up a demo, a booth, showing off how these hardware mannequins can be connected to Polymer in a migration from old Windows software to modern web. And that was pretty awesome. Also, I think it was great that 2 things in particular. That first of all the Googlers who came there, big cadeau to them, is they are super approachable, from experts to novice. They listen and they interact. also that there was something for everybody there. It was not only for the hipster communities, and I think that made the Polymer Summit on par, for me at least, with the Chrome Dev I went to last year. That was pretty cool.
Yeah, so I was able to go to last year's in London. I wasn't able to make it this year, which is a real shame. But do you think was there an overall theme that you think they were trying to put across, or is it just lots of different bits and pieces of information?
Use the platform. That was pretty obvious, at least.
Well, I think the user platform has been like the Polymer theme for a long time. So I think what is like clear to me this time around is that like they released like Polymer 2.0. They finally caught up with like these latest standards. And now they're looking beyond that and figuring out like how do we make like Polymer more approachable to people and web components more approachable to people. And we saw that with like them giving up, like realizing that well HTML import is not going to make it. So hey, how do we align with the platform? How do we make the platform come to you instead of just telling people to use the platform? How do we also move Polymer close to the platform itself? I think that was one of the big themes this year. Plus as well that web components is here. Like big companies like Electronic Arts are using web components. The new YouTube is built with web components. Apparently they have like a huge catalog of different web components. I think they're talking about like more than 200. And they're like it's at scale. You also see that big companies like Ionic, which is really popular in the hybrid communities, doing hybrid apps, or in the Angular community because it's used with Angular. They're also moving to web components. So I think they're showing that web components is actually something you can use today. You don't need to use Polymer itself. And even if you're using Polymer, we try to align Polymer more with the platform itself. That's what it's always have been about, and that's what they're doing now.
So that's a really big statement, isn't it? Web components are here because it's taken a while to get here, and there's been some amazing work done from loads of different people. It's particularly around the polyfills, because obviously it's not fully supported across all of the browsers, so you still do need polyfills in some situations. But there is unfortunately still bugs in some of the polyfills, and I think Polymer itself, I think, works really nicely with the polyfills, but I know in experience I've come across some bugs using like writing vanilla web components that prevented me for kind of using web components on some platforms. What do you kind of think of that kind of statement? Web components are finally here. Do you agree that web components are here just across the board? Everybody can go ahead and use them. We should rely on the polyfills. Do you think it's fine with Polymer, or do you think there could still be some problems for people trying to use vanilla web components across all of the major platforms with the polyfills in production?
If I could say something about that, because I've been working in a legacy company where it's very important to have a solution that lasts for years and not just relies on frameworks a bit in flux. And even though there are minor glitches now, it's super important that you have something that will align to the standards. And even though it's not completely there yet for all the browsers, it does solve a real world problem, and managers in these old companies are extremely happy about paying budgets for development teams going that direction.
Yeah, I guess it also depends on what you really need, right? So we talked about like Stencil or like Ionic using web components as well. So Ionic is actually not using like Shadow DOM currently. So if you don't need Shadow DOM, it might work a bit better. So you can already use like a custom elements. And they're actually not relying on the web on the polyfills done by the Polymer team, but actually using this, I think called document.register is another polyfill as well. Let me see what its name was. I think it's called
document register element. I think if it's the one I'm thinking.
That's another polyfill. So there's definitely a different option out there, and that works down to like IE8. Of course, there's some quirks and some things you should be aware of, but I think that like with everything else you use today, every framework, you run into problems on some platforms, depending on what platforms you want to support. That's just how it is.
So I guess, I mean, can you maybe elaborate a little bit more on some of your thoughts around the hashtag use the platform? I mean, so it's very exciting, and obviously I think many of us agree that this is the future of the web. But there's a lot of framework authors and a lot of people. I mean, I'm not sure that Polymer and web components have the adoption, that they should at this stage. And so what are your thoughts on that?
What do you mean with they don't have the amount of adoption that this should?
Yeah, in the sense, I think that frameworks like React, Angular, Vue, Preact are still really, really popular. And
Sure, I think that speaks a bit to the history and of the Polymer team and what they've been trying to accomplish. They didn't set out to create like another framework to promote like only Polymer, and I think that's also one of the reasons why it has been held back a bit. Because unlike other framework authors that go out and do talks everywhere and promoting their framework and can move ahead really fast because they don't need to align with anything, Polymer has really been a different approach. They looked at, in the beginning, Polymer was kind of like an experiment to see like, how do we form these web components as standards? Is this actually what we want to use? They realized pretty quickly that that's not good enough. People, they actually need to be able to use it. Otherwise, people don't. So they created like Polymer 1.0. It became a stable product. Then they worked a lot together with Amal and other browser vendors actually to get these specifications implemented in browsers itself. And that required, there was a bit of ping and pong forward, and it was around the time that ECMAScript 2015 was released, ECMAScript 6. It came with classes, so how were like web components supposed to integrate with classes? That resulted in major changes to the specs themselves. And then kind of like Polymer, instead of just like moving ahead and working on improving the framework and promoting it, they had to take like a step back and actually start to rewrite all the polyfills, move all of Polymer to the newest standards. So they kind of like been a bit held back, I think, and I think that's probably explains why it hasn't been so popular. And I think that now finally the Polymer 2.0 is out. A lot of the components they've done like a nice migration path for everyone who invested in Polymer. But it's also the time to look ahead to see like, what do we do with HTML imports if no one is ever going to implement it? Can we use something different? Like, could we use ECMAScript 6 modules instead, which is proven quite popular? And what do we do with the other things? Is this templating things really nice? All these other people like using Preact or even like with Skate.js, they use like JSX for writing the HTML code inside the components and inside JavaScript. So could Polymer use something similar? Why are people actually using JSX? What is it that makes it so popular? So I think Polymer is kind of at this point in time where they're looking ahead and figuring out like, how do we fix Polymer? How do we even like remove all the parts of Polymer that we don't need? Make it come closer to the platform itself. Because that's also the point with Polymer is like something like Preact is really, really small. But Polymer, because it has to have all these polyfills, it's not that small. So some people complain about that because that's a problem for load time. So I think that there's a reason why Polymer hasn't made it that really yet. I still think it's a really, really great framework or like library. But myself, I like web components more. I really like writing vanilla web components. And I think that it feels that Polymer is becoming closer and closer to vanilla web components with removing all of the different, all the magic. And that's really something I like.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. And I think you're right that like, oddly enough, the Polymer team is kind of striving to kind of work themselves out of the Polymer, right? I mean, the goal eventually is just vanilla web components. But until the tooling and the specs are there, we're not going to be able to have that universally. So I guess getting back to the Polymer Summit. So what were the major themes that you guys saw?
Well, I think it's maybe better to explain, like to talk about some of the talks which I liked. So what other people liked. So I think like the first talk that I really liked was electronic arts. because they took a different approach, was really approachable to a lot of people there. So a lot of people I talked to, they came maybe from small agencies doing like websites for different companies. And some of these companies, they maybe like a TV station or a newspaper, they don't just have one site. They might have like 20 different sites. It's just like Electronic Arts, they're shipping new video games, and each video game, it needs like a site that looks like really specific to that game, but also need to like be able to develop it really quickly without having all the bugs to worry about. So it's kind of like a situation which a lot of companies are in, and they really showed really well how web components help them, how they create these custom elements which were easy themable, while they could ensure that some parts of the of all the web pages would look exactly the same across the board, and how they could ship it. So I think that a lot of people in the audience who were not really sold on web components in general, they really liked this talk and really thought about, wow, this is what I've been needing for a long time. So I think that was a really great talk. What I also liked a lot is, like, of course, the news about Polymer itself. They dropped. We've talked about this a few times now. They dropped HTML imports. They realized that this is not going to happen. There might be some interest in doing like HTML modules at some point, but everyone else is doing JavaScript, and I don't think it's that bad, because like if you're going to write code that, for instance, runs in the service worker, and maybe even have the same code or very similar code running on your server and on the service worker, maybe in the future when we have streams and all of that, well, you don't have DOM access there. So if you want to generate DOM, it has to be string based. It has to be done with JavaScript.
Kenneth, maybe you can elaborate a bit on the concerns that have been posted both on Twitter and GitHub and whatnot about that point in particular.
What point?
That now we're moving away from the HTML templates to JavaScript. There was some concern.
I'm just trying to say that, like, from my point of view, I think it's okay. If you think about it, like, whether I have my HTML in a .html file, it's still going to be text. Even in JavaScript, it's basically text. And even with JavaScript has something called like HTML literals. We'll get back to that, which make it really fast at dealing with strings. So it's kind of the same. It's just like depending on where you actually have the HTML code. And for me, it's about having your tools, like your IDE, actually understand what you're doing, being able to do auto-completion and things like that. So of course, there are people that really want to do like declarative web components, and that's still going to be possible. And there's still like research going into how do you do like maybe HTML modules. But for now, Polymer decided that they are adopting ECMAScript 6 modules, and they're looking at how that will work. So in the short term, it means that you, instead of using the template tag in HTML and referring to it, you'll have to write everything in the .js file. That's become pretty nice because it can become like a JS module, and it can be imported as well. Inside your Polymer element, you'll have a few functions, something called like template, which actually return that element. Or actually the DOM content as a string. So now the interesting part, like what the Polymer team has been looking at, is that how can, I was mentioning that before, like people are using JSX, we're using templates. What is the future? What makes the most sense? So basically everyone who's like JavaScript based are using something like JSX. So JSX, I actually find it really nice because it allows you to write like a render function, a function returning HTML. And inside this HTML, you can kind of like use JavaScript. You probably know from Polymer, you have something like DOM repeat. It might not be as flexible as JSX, where in JSX you actually have JavaScript support inside. So you can have like if sentences, you can do while loops, you can filter out an array before you actually kind of like stamp out the DOM content. And I think that's really nice. So one of the engineers, Justin on the Polymer team, he looked at how this kind of reminds him about like ECMAScript 6 or ECMAScript 2015 string template literals. So you probably know that already from JavaScript, that you can write these like template literals and mix in JavaScript or like refer to like properties and stuff like that. So using this, you could actually write something like HTML. And the idea they have, or he had, is that you use that to stamp out like a template element and put that in HTML. So it basically just generates the HTML for you. Now the cool thing is that it can actually remember like the holes you have in your kind of a DOM tree. So when you do the same thing, generate the same template literal, or like it can return the exact same thing only with those changes. So it's kind of like a virtual DOM. It's a bit difficult to explain. So in a virtual DOM, you generate a light DOM, and then every time you do changes, you generate another light DOM, and you compare them using a different algorithm. Then when you have you find out what the changes are, you make those changes to the DOM, kind of like batching all these changes. But the problem with or what could be a problem with a virtual DOM is that first of all, you use more memory because you have to have these virtual DOMs in memory, and you need to generate a new one every time and compare them. But most of the DOM is normally static. It never changes. So you might have a lot of elements and just like one place where you just change maybe one value. So it's kind of wasteful.
Also the shadow DOM is not really compatible with that, is it?
No,
not with a full page application where you have to diff it.
Right. So with this, well, you could probably make that work. I haven't thought about that, but still, like this would work for the shadow DOM as well. So the thing is that it will just like figure out the exact same template, like a string literal template literal, and it will just like apply those changes directly. So it's pretty efficient and it's a really nice of developing, which reminds me very, very much of JSX. With one big difference, you don't need any tooling, and it's natively supported in JavaScript 2015. So that's super, super exciting.
And specifically, we're talking about lit HTML here, right?
Yes. So that is the project what Justin is working on. So that is of course like intended to be something that will probably integrate into Polymer in the future, but it's also a standalone thing, so you can use it in your own custom elements today. And I've actually done that, and it's really, really nice. It provides you like all the things I like about JSX without all the things that I dislike.
Yeah, so for any listeners that are interested to learn a bit more about how lit HTML and the virtual DOM kind of differ, last week we had an episode with the author of Hyper HTML, which is a very similar library, and we go into a little bit more detail about how the virtual DOM works and how it compares to something like lit HTML and Hyper HTML. So go and check that one out.
We were talking about some stuff. So we're talking about a lot of stuff going on at Polymer Summit. And we've mentioned some of these things kind of individually, but where a lot of this stuff comes from, like ES6 using JavaScript modules, or ES6 imports, or ES 2015 imports versus HTML imports. It's that they announced a new version of Polymer, right? They announced Polymer version 3, which is the next major version bump. Is there anything else to add about Polymer 3? It's in, I know if you is it in developer preview or something like that now?
Yeah, it is. It's in developer preview. So yeah, Polymer 3 was required. They're trying to keep as much as the API as possible, but as they're moving to ECMAScript 2015 modules, they have to make some changes. One of the other things that they're doing while they're doing that is they're actually moving to NPM. With NPM, it actually means yarn because Polymer requires flattened modules, and that's actually a requirement by web components because you can only define a module once. So if you don't have flattened modules, you might have a sub module or like custom elements which includes the same element but a different version of it, and that wouldn't actually work in Polymer or in web components. So they really need to flatten all the dependencies. And currently only Yarn supports that.
Which is pretty cool. The community's been pretty excited about Yarn for a while. If anybody's not familiar with Yarn, does somebody want to give a very brief overview about what Yarn is?
Well, I don't know all the details, but I believe Yarn is like npm. It uses the same like backend, the same database. It's basically a different front end, which has a few extra features. I believe it's developed by Facebook, and I know a lot of the Google, especially on the Polymer team, they had a lot of input on the requirements for Yarn, and apparently it's faster as well. But like people also work on npm, so I guess like in the near future they might have the exact same feature set. So it's just like whatever you prefer.
Cool. And also to clarify something that was said before, when you said that it uses the same backend, you don't have to. If you publish something to npm, you can install it via Yarn.
Right.
So you don't have to. It's not an entirely separate repository, and I just want to make sure that that's pointed out, so you don't have to worry about, oh, am I going to have to publish my custom elements, my web components to a bunch of different places? No, you can still just publish them to the same place, and you can install them with Yarn from there.
Yeah, Yarn is a package manager, much like JSPM was a package manager that's still pulled from npm or GitHub as needed. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about Polymer 3 in terms of like what the timelines are, and I think what the major, like, are there some key features that we're getting with Polymer 3? What are the differences besides, obviously the shift to using ES6 imports?
Well, my guess is that Polymer 3 they really didn't want to do Polymer 3, but they had to because of these changes. It's in preview. It will be done whenever it's done. So this is all about like doing like moving everything to npm and making everything work with the ECMAScript 2015 modules. So that's basically the difference. And they're really trying to not make any API changes unless they need to. But they are working on a tool which will allow you to take your like Polymer 2.0 like elements and automatically port them whenever possible to Polymer 3.0. So like the upgrade path should be pretty straightforward.
But Kenneth, actually, after looking into lit HTML myself and looking at Polymer 3, I must admit that my gut feeling is that I would probably move to lit HTML. Do you think that the Polymer team have considered that others might do that as well? Because there is a big step for some people from Polymer 2 to Polymer 3. Which would be similar to moving from Polymer 2 to lit HTML, which is much smaller. So what do you think?
I think these things are not like fully thought out yet. So I know that Justin is thinking about like how to integrate like lit HTML nicely, like having maybe like a specific like component. So instead of having maybe inheriting from Polymer.element, you might inherit from Polymer.lit HTML element or something like similar. So I do believe that, I don't know if that will be part of Polymer 3.0, but I believe it will be an option. And it's not like lit HTML versus Polymer. I think lit HTML is going to be part of Polymer, and you can decide whether you want to use it or not.
Yeah, I think so too. But probably as Justin is working on the tooling for both, I'm pretty sure that it will be integrated as soon as we will reach the production-ready versions of both. But truly, the lit HTML is excellent, awesome. I tried it a few times, and now I can't look back again, like the step from Angular to Polymer. Sorry, Angular.
No, that's awesome. The lit HTML seems like a very, very cool thing. It'll be very cool if it ends up making it as part. I mean, which would not be an unheard of thing. For example, Ember Team, right, with Glimmer is their kind of like their component model, their rendering engine for stuff which you can use outside of Ember, which is pretty cool.
I actually wanted to point out something about lit HTML. If you look at the repository, and that is that the plan with lit HTML is just as Polymer. It's supposed to be part of the platform. It's supposed to die away in a few years. He actually like just actually split up lit HTML into like the library called lit HTML.js and a few extension points. And that's because he believed that what is in lit HTML itself is something which could be pretty well standardized. And there's already a discussion going on in in the web components working group with, for instance, people from Apple. So that's definitely something which could be standardized. What he believed might be a bit more like difficult to standardize, something like event handlers and extension points, he turned into like other libraries. So it's in like lit-html -lib something. So that's kind of really a nice approach, that they're really trying to figure out what is the right API and how do we make like nice extension points. So even if like lit-html, like only like 90% of it gets standardized, people can still like extend it. So I find that pretty cool as well.
For sure. So moving off of Polymer specifically, Rob Dotson gave a talk that I've unfortunately not had a chance to watch yet, but he gave a talk called Custom Elements Everywhere, and it is, from what I can tell, it's supposed to be a guide for how to integrate custom elements specifically into modern day frameworks. And I believe there's even a website that's set up that assigns them a score, can run a framework through, or a library through, a certain set of tests and tell it how compatible it is with web components. Angular 2 and up, for example, is extremely compatible. I haven't looked at all of the others. I know React has a few. You can make them work, but there are a few weird things that you have to do. Do we want to talk a little bit more about that talk and about that initiative, I guess, to show how to use these custom elements in existing frameworks, which also means bringing new stuff into your old projects?
Yeah, I think that's kind of interesting, especially now when you see like something like Ionic also moves to web components. And the reason why they're doing that is also because like people already have projects out there. They might have invested in using Angular or React, and it would be sad if that means that they cannot adopt like web components. But some of these frameworks, they make some assumptions. There's a few things that makes these things not work so well, or not work with the polyfills. So the talk was about like how you design like these web components. Rob has done that before in like a few like blog posts. Like you should probably, like, every time you change an attribute, when should an attribute be reflected through property and the other way around, and when shouldn't it be? That was some of these things that he discussed. But then also like what are the bugs today if I want to use web components in React and Preact. So actually on the website he's kind of giving like a score, and he actually filed bugs for all of these things. So my take is that this is made it really public, and it also means there's a bit of pressure on like these framework authors to actually go and fix these things. And when they do, like it just means that you can use like web components everywhere, which is super cool.
Yeah, I really liked the information that Rob provided in that talk. I think anybody who is planning on writing vanilla web components should check it out. Some great pointers in there. It's really easy to follow. So I think really valuable information. And as you said, it'd be great to be able to go to one place and see all of the different frameworks that and their level of compatibility with custom elements, and put pressure on the framework authors to fix it up, so we can start to actually use these web components across all these different ecosystems, which is the promise of web components, really, isn't it?
Definitely.
And it's also helpful just when you have, it might seem arbitrary at times, but it is helpful when you can assign a number to something, when you can give something a score, because if that is one of your, for example, before we picked Angular here at LiveSafe for a lot of our new work, one of the criteria that I was looking at was how well does this work with web components, because I am counting on that being something that we're going to do. So having something like this that's available and it's being added to all the time. I think we even said in the this week in the web at the beginning of the show mentioned that there's already new stuff being added to it, which is excellent. And I believe you can just submit a PR to that website's repository to add new frameworks.
I also think it's kind of important for the future of like Polymer and web components itself, because either you Polymer need to involve and include like solutions to how do you deal with like data structures, how do you deal with state, but some of these things are not that clear. There was a talk about like how you could use like Redux together with Polymer, but in the future, if instead like frameworks just becomes like frameworks around web components, then you could choose your framework not for the component model, but for like all these other batteries they include. And like maybe you like Redux, maybe you like something else, maybe you like the Angular way of doing things. But it's nice that you can change the framework, but you can still like retain all of your different components. So like the framework becomes about like the overall structure of how you create an app, and not about all the components you use to build your app from or with.
I totally agree.
And there's also the opportunity then for I mean, we're going to be talking about Stencil pretty soon, but stuff like that where you can have a framework or a compiler or whatever you want to call it that will just, the end result is web components. And then the framework itself doesn't have to worry about maintaining its own component model, which is fantastic.
I think you just described a beautiful future, Danny. But no, honestly, that type of like interoperability and compatibility is just it just creates like a really healthy ecosystem for everyone to work in. And I know one of the things that really made React so popular and adoptable quickly initially was that I could put a piece of I could have some React components in my Backbone legacy app or my Angular app or what it kind of fit in everywhere, and that same type of interoperability translated into React Native nicely, and so it just it feels like that's kind of the where things are really moving towards, and it's exciting.
I was wondering if I could just take a step back from all the hipster talk to mention something that I have learned through the last couple of years working with traditional industry. If that's okay with you guys, because I think it's pretty exciting to see that there's been, and there's no doubt about this, there's sort of a Microsoft monopoly in the legacy industry where you have on all levels C# apps, Windows Presentation Foundation, and Asia, whatnot. And it's very difficult for these industries to move to anything else but that, even in the far future, if you ask themselves. But 3 different areas of web technology that I see is actually providing a viable migration path for that legacy industry. And I talked to some of them about it, and they're pretty excited. So one thing is the progressive web apps, which provides for them important offline and native behavior, so their customers see something that they're accustomed to, and the rollout is much easier than rolling out native apps. And as an extra benefit, it also works across multiple platforms, so they don't have to maintain software for deployment for all kinds of versions of Windows and Mac and so forth. The other thing that we have been talking about is web components. Something that has been very important for these companies is that it's not relying on frameworks and Flux, because React, Angular, Ember, whatnot is super cool and all this, but as we all know, there's a new framework every half year, new versions of every framework, whatever, and these companies usually do not allocate budget for transforming whatever they do internally every year. They may have 5-year or 10-year plans, and that's just how it is. There's also the other thing that it has a minimal overhead, so it's not like they're depending on something huge that they cannot comprehend coming from a native developer background. I personally saw the joy of the people finally understanding what was actually going on in I know they don't want to call it framework, but still library, Polymer, as opposed to Angular, Ember, and React and other things they tried out, because it's so thin, it's so easy to understand what's going on there. So the migration for even the native developers moving to web, it's easy. It's easy to comprehend because it's small modules, so it's easy to test and upgrade small parts as they go along. They can begin small as noobs, and they end as experts after a few months, and they can go back to the components they want to rewrite and do that without losing focus because of a huge snowball. They can have these small components. And the last thing I think is super cool is the hardware connectivity through Web USB and Web Bluetooth. It really enables some of these legacy hardware and software companies to revive their old hardware and connect it to the web. something that has not been possible without native drivers, or in the case of one of the companies I work with, ActiveX, that kept it on Internet Explorer 11 for a long time. And at the summit, I got a chance to talk to Vardin, and I think maybe they're looking into providing a migration path for the companies who are working with the Windows Presentation Foundation in C# to move that one-to-one to web. And I'm super excited about this because it means that all of a sudden we have a complete package in standards that will enable these companies to move much faster and leaner than they have been able to for years. So that's pretty cool.
Yeah, Lars, like I couldn't agree with you more. Like it's very exciting. And at the risk of, like you said, calling React and Angular and all these other JS libraries hipsterish, I think the point that you're trying to make is that, like, Polymer web components are kind of really built on standards, right? And standards are long term, and it's really easy for these large enterprises to get behind them without, having to, constantly retrain their dev teams or, rewrite their clients every 3 to 5 years. So, it's super exciting. And actually, Vaadin is a really interesting company. Can you elaborate a little bit more on Vaadin for our listeners?
Yeah, Vardin is a Finnish-based company that is doing a super exciting web components for the enterprise. I believe they're providing a lot of free components, and then they have a few paid ones, a little bit like the Qt model, or with what is it called, DevExpress on the C# side. And they're putting a lot of effort into making them enterprise ready. So it's not just yet another button or whatever. It's something that the enterprise will actually save a lot of money on using for both long tail products, but also for these huge installations that goes places that nobody in the public ever hear about.
So actually talking about like native developers, like I've been a native developer and even an app developer myself, and one of the things that you do when creating like these native apps, especially for instance like on Windows, is that you always use a toolkit. There's already like you just include like you do some layouting, you put in like a toolbar there, some buttons there, a scrolling region there. That's kind of like how native developers approach these things. But when being thrown to the web, it's basically like, oh God, there's nothing there. You want a button? Create a button. Figure out how to style it. And it's kind of like you have to do everything customized. And I think that's kind of really scary for a lot of people. And they don't really like that. And that brings me to a company called Ionic. Because Ionic is actually one of those companies which has been not just, it's a web company loving the web, but they've been targeting app developers, especially app developers doing native apps. So all these companies doing native apps, they normally don't have the resources to do an iOS app and an Android app or a Windows app and all of that. So what Ionic provides these people is that it provides them with a framework with all these components already existing. So you just take in your bottom, your scrolling region and whatnot. And more than that, it looks really like Android on Android. It looks really like Windows on Windows. It looks really like iOS on iOS, while it still allows you to go and theme things. So Ionic has become really, really popular. You create these hybrid apps, basically powered by Cordova, plus what they call Ionic native, which is not something like React Native. It's not really native. It's like native Cordova plugins for Ionic. And what I heard from the team is that they're actually working on aligning some of these plugins, like the Bluetooth one, to be aligned with Web Bluetooth, like to use the exact same APIs. So one of the things that was interesting at the summit is that they talked a bit about like Ionic and the future of Ionic. So Ionic is, of course, looking at progressive web apps because that's becoming a big thing, and that's pretty awesome. But when they actually try to create these progressive web apps with Ionic, which is based on Angular currently, they're just not fast enough. Which was one of the reasons why they start to look at web components to see if they could remove some of these frameworks, because they're deep down, Ionic is a web company, not an Angular company. So they always wanted to create these like really, really components that work on the web. And of course, there's already these companies like already invested in maybe Angular JS, like the old version of Angular, also called Angular 1 by some people, or like React. So with web components, they could use Ionic as well. So Ionic's approach was a bit different. They're not using Polymer. They create like their own custom elements. They're currently not using Shadow DOM because they kind of wanted to keep the same API, the same styling things that they have today. Plus, it can be a bit tricky to style web component, especially Shadow DOM, until we get like some new specs that Google are working on to make that easier. So they, having used Angular for a long time, they really got to love TypeScript. So they decided to create like this small compiler called Stencil, where they can write their own web components using TypeScript and a few extensions like that are in TypeScript, such as like decorators, and then like JSX. So they basically have like a virtual DOM and all of that. So you just write your web components in Stencil, run the Stencil compiler, and it outputs a pure web component, which doesn't depend on anything. So that's pretty cool. And they say that they're actually pretty far along. So when they release like the next big version of Ionic, you'll actually have all of these components, and you can use them with Angular or with React, even with Polymer. And I think that's super awesome. And I think that will really, really bring web components to so many other developers, even native developers, and might make it much more popular than it is today.
And on top of that, you'll get all of the benefits of having like a structured way to create the components. You'll get all the TypeScript benefits, and that is, it does look really cool. Great project.
And we have a show with them soon, don't we? We have a show on Stencil.
Yep, we're going to be recording in the next couple of weeks, so hopefully it won't be long before it's released.
That's super exciting.
Excellent. I'm very much looking forward to that.
Do we have time to talk about server-side rendering? Or, I mean, I guess like Lars, you get to pick the last topic. Lars's pick, how about
that? My pick, server-side rendering. Go ahead.
Okay. No, then go ahead. So I guess what's anything new with server-side rendering in Polymer, or any updates that anything exciting that was announced at the summit?
Yeah, well, if Lars is not doesn't want to talk, I can talk about server-side rendering. So first of all, a lot of people have been talking about it's not just about putting things on screen. It's all about like time to interactive. But for some companies, it's really important that all their content get indexed really well, especially if you're an e-commerce company. Lots of like believe like the Bing index of the crawler doesn't support all of that much like JavaScript. The Google crawler does, but it's based on Chromium 41, so really old. Doesn't really support like Web Components version 1. So if you really want all of these things working on the web, you need to do something. It's all about like search engine optimizations. So Google actually announced something called RenderTron, which you can integrate, which would actually use, I believe it's based on headless Chrome. Will actually, it's not really server-side rendering, but it'll kind of help you do the search engine optimizations in one way. There's also the author of Skate.js. He actually made server-side rendering work with Shadow DOM by introducing a shadow root tag. So where you actually will pull out everything like a light DOM, and you'll render that on screen, and then they'll get upgraded or rehydrated, as it's called, to become like real web components on the front end. So there's a lot of things going on there. There's a lot of people thinking about this area, and it looks pretty exciting.
That's super awesome. And I think that brings us to the end of the show. And big thank you to both Ken and Lars for being such awesome guests. And you guys are awesome. And yes, we have some upcoming shows on Couchbase, Stencil, in talks with Eric Myers to come on. He's like the godfather of CSS, the author of the CSS Definitive Guide, and has written all important books on CSS. And we have some of our past shows as well on web browser APIs and HyperHTML that you can check out as well. So any last words, Ken and Lars? Where can people find you guys on the web?
Well, I have a Danish Twitter. It's called Den Ladeside, DNLADESIDE. I should change
It
that.
means the lazy side.
The lazy side.
Yeah, my Twitter handle is just Kenneth Rohde, and Rohde is ROHDE. So you can find me on Twitter.
Excellent. Well, like Amal said, thank you guys very, very much. And thank you, Amal and Leon, for hanging out yet again. This has been the Web Platform Podcast, episode number 136, Polymer Summit Recap. We'll talk to you all next week.